Welcome to the CMA webinar series. I'm Mike Wilkening, Communications Manager here at ARC, and I will be your host for today's webinar. Shopper Signals, Seizing the Clean Label Opportunity in Frozen Meals, hosted by our friends at Harmonia and Nestlé. Now, clean label has become one of the most crowded spaces at shelf. But what does clean label mean? Well, that depends on the shopper you happen to talk to at that moment. Some think in terms of ingredients, others think about transparency in nutrition, others focus on sourcer ethics in terms of where their products are from. In short, it's a varied answer, but it's a non-negotiable for those shoppers in a lot of cases on those specifics. So what does this mean for category teams that are trying to build assortment and merchandising strategy around health? It means they're scrambling about where to know to invest. So in this session, we're here to help. Harmonia and Nestle are going to walk through today how a shopper-driven analysis of the frozen meals category translated more than 115,000 shopper conversations into 4 distinct health territories, and then quantified each of those against a UPC series of sales data. The result is, and finally, a clear view of what shoppers actually mean when they talk about clean label, how big each of those territories are, and where the shelf maybe doesn't reflect what shoppers are actually asking and looking for. Now, we want this to be interactive today, so please do chime in on the chat and also the Q&A section, and we'll have time for your questions at the end. It's my pleasure now to introduce our presenters today. Heather Bentley leads category strategy for the frozen meals business at Nestle USA, where she drives category growth through the development and execution of differentiated, insight-led strategies, optimizing product development, assortment, merchandising, pricing, and promotions across both in-store and e-commerce channels. Now, Heather has been with Nestle for 6 years, supporting category strategy across multiple businesses and partnering closely with cross-functional teams to deliver impactful shopper-centric growth. We're also pleased to welcome John Groth, Senior Customer Success Manager at Harmonia, who partners with enterprise CPG teams to turn product intelligence into actionable category and competitive strategies. Now, before his time at Harmonia, he spent more than 5 years at P&G's Analytics and Insights organization, specializing in e-commerce, category analytics, and media analytics. Now, John is based in Chicago, and he enjoys making pottery and playing tennis in his free time. So I believe we can dub him then a clay court specialist for those that are going to be interested in watching the French Open here in a couple weeks. With that, I will hand it over to John and Heather to get started. John, Heather, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you for having us today. So just a bit of background for everyone. As part of our category strategy team at Nestle, as Mike alluded to, we are responsible for building assortments and merchandising strategies, as well as working with our cross-functional teams on product development. And more, we were finding that in our conversations, the term clean label kept coming up to the surface. And whether that was conversations in what consumers were talking about or what our retail partners were asking us, or even in terms of government regulations. But the real question became, what does clean label mean? What are consumers, how are they defining what clean label means? So our team knew from past research that health is really evolving and shifting. It's shifting from more of a subtractive health, where you're talking about less fat, fewer calories, this idea of like an absence of negatives. It's evolving to be more additive health, where you're talking about more protein and more fiber and more functional ingredients and more of an idea of a presence of positives. But again, what we didn't know is when you're talking about clean label, what does it mean to consumers? How large is this space? Is it growing? Is this, a future opportunity? So that's when we decided to partner with John and the Harmonia team to help us answer some of these questions. And so today we're going to walk you through the work that we did with Harmonia. And by the end of this session, you'll better be able to understand the different clean label demand themes that we uncovered and where there's gaps between what us as manufacturers and brand teams are talking about and what consumers are actually interested in and what they're talking about. And we'll also show you a framework for how you can size that gap between what you might be talking about as a manufacturer and what consumers are interested in, how you can develop, a framework to size that for your own category. And so now I'm going to turn it over to John from Harmonia, and he's going to walk you through our work.
Wonderful. Thank you, Heather, and thank you, Mike, for the warm welcome. So before we get into the case study itself, I wanted to take a moment to talk about Harmonia, introduce who we are, what types of data we're able to provide. So at Harmonia, at our core, we are a product attributes company. We help CPG companies and retailers both understand what's going on in their category, as well as translating those insights to different types of action, whether that's through innovation, marketing, or other strategies. In terms of the way that we help our clients understand their category, there are primarily three different ways that we generate our insights. So the first way is through consumer sentiment. We collect rating and review data from over 300 different retailers to be able to identify what are some of the different ways that consumers are talking about the products within your category. Mike mentioned it earlier, but in the case of frozen meals, we have over 115,000 reviews that we use as the baseline for our analysis. Within consumer sentiment, we also have access to social listening. So if you wanted to understand how are consumers talking about your products or your category on Reddit or other social media platforms, that's a way where people talk much more organically than they might within a consumer review. Next, we also have enriched attributes, which we call tags. These are going to be different product attributes that are created based off of either the way the manufacturer is describing the products on the product page, through the item description, what is communicated on pack, as well as how are the consumers describing the product within reviews. Through these tags, we're able to identify what claims are going to be associated with a product or what ingredients do these products have, the target audience, consumer benefits. There's a long list of different types of tags that we're able to associate at the UPC level. And lastly, we bring in sales data as well. So once we merge in sales performance with all of our different tags, that's where we're able to identify what claims are driving the most growth within your category right now. What are some of the ingredients that consumers might be avoiding that's reflecting in the sales data? And more importantly, where are you showing up within some of these tags as well? What is your share of them? And so by combining all three of these elements, we're able to come up with a very comprehensive way of analyzing the category. And there are a lot of creative analyses that we can do on a category to be able to identify what's driving your growth and what are some of the opportunity spaces. And so today we're going to be walking through one of those ways, which is demand intelligence. So this is one of the ways we're able to slice the category and identify different groups of products that are created based off of our tags. This allows you to create groups of products that aren't traditionally accessible through a traditional manufacturer brand category hierarchy. To do this analysis, the way it works is we identify different demand themes, and from there we can analyze how are they performing, what are some of the trends that are relating to each of these different themes. So to start this analysis, we first have to identify what are the different demand themes that we want to analyze. Heather had shared earlier that they wanted to really unpack this concept of clean label, but what does it actually mean? What does it mean to consumers? And one of the things we quickly realized is that this means different things to different people. And so this is where we pulled in our consumer review data. We looked through all 115,000 plus reviews to be able to identify what are the different ways that consumers are talking about clean label. We identified these different buckets like nutritional and functional benefits, responsible sourcing and ethics, diet and lifestyle friendly, among many others that at its core were a lot of different ways that people were talking about this concept. Once we had identified our different demand themes, we then pulled together what are the different tags that are going to be associated with each of them. So, a very simple example, in the case of nutritional and functional benefits, we associated the three tags high protein, fiber, and immune support, meaning that any UPC that's associated with any of these three tags would then be rolled up into the nutritional and functional benefits demand theme. Of course, all of these, this is just a simple example. We came up with a very long list of different tags, dozens and I think even hundreds at this point, that rolled into these different demand themes. So it's a very comprehensive list that we're creating to define these different demand theme buckets. And then lastly, and this is the fun part, or at least the fun part for me, was analyzing the performance. So once we identify what products are associated with each demand theme, we can start to unpack shares, growth rates, sizing, and other types of opportunities that can be associated with each of them. Wonderful. So this is an example of how we might analyze some of the different demand themes within an analysis. I do want to point out that all of this data is illustrative. None of it is real. So if you try to go, making some innovation based off of the data on this slide, you're probably going to be disappointed. But each of these different demand themes, we can see how many UPCs are associated with it, and how many dollar sales are associated with it as well. In this case, we can see Free From has 920 UPCs at a little under $750 million, and it's currently declining year over year. One of the really powerful ways that you can use to interpret this data is analyze how is it performing versus the total category. And so in this case, we can see that Free From is declining faster than the total category, which is one way that you can really start to harness these insights. Another way that we can slice this data is by pulling in your share to see, is your brand over or underdeveloped within this theme versus where you are in the total category. We can see that in the total category, our hypothetical brand has about a 25% share. In some of these instances, like functional and wellness benefits, sourcing and ethics, we can see we are significantly underneath 25% share, meaning that this is an opportunity space. If your brand wanted to, potentially innovate within this space to, lean into this area more, you would have your share. You would have an opportunity for your share to grow here. Now, because all of this data is at the UPC level, we also have a lot of other ways that we can slice this data. In this case, I pulled in what is the top brand within each of these demand themes as well as their share. But we can also pull in a lot of other things like what are the top UPCs within each of these? Is your brand the top UPC? What are some of the other tags that are strongly associated with these demand themes or other unique ways of slicing this information to be able to make sure you're extracting the insight that you need. One of the ways that we can visualize this information is by plotting it on a maturity curve. So these are all of the same demand themes that you saw on the previous slide, just visualized slightly differently. In this case, we bucketed each demand theme into these maturity stages: nascent, emerging, growing, mature, or declining, which are calculated based off of how developed is this demand theme within the category. How many brands are currently participating within this demand theme, and what percent of the category is actually reflective of these types of products? Using this, we're able to identify what are some of the demand themes or groups of products that are still growing and are a little under the radar in the category, where they haven't been fully adopted across the board and many manufacturers haven't moved on. In this case, we can see that functional and wellness benefits is one demand theme that hasn't quite been fully adopted across the category. Inversely, we can see that a couple of these demand themes, like nutritional and free from, are at their peak. They are mature, meaning that these are almost table stakes in the category. It's something that consumers are expecting from the products. And by having one of these attributes on your products, you aren't necessarily differentiating yourself from other manufacturers. We can also see what demand themes are declining, which ones are past their maturity stage right now, which is always helpful as you're coming out with new innovation. And so based off of all of the different ways we've sliced the data so far, we ultimately found 4 different demand themes that we wanted to zoom in on a little closer because we had identified them as different spaces that might be a good opportunity for innovation. Again, all hypothetical data. These demand themes were nutritional and functional benefits, ingredient integrity, responsible sourcing and ethics, and diet and lifestyle friendly. Now, again, all of our different tags are going to be based off of either how is the brand describing these products on the product page on retailer websites, like the item description, what is on pack, what's in the title, ingredient lists, etc. And then they're also sourced based off of how are consumers talking about these products in reviews. And a lot of times what we see is that there's a gap between the way a manufacturer is talking about a concept as well as the way the consumer is talking about a topic. And it's oftentimes that gap that reveals the opportunity space. That's the white space for a manufacturer to be able to innovate against or market against. And so in this case, we can start to unpack within each of these different demand themes, where's this conversation actually being sourced from? Is it the manufacturer leading the conversation or the consumer? In this case, for ingredient integrity, we can see that 90% of the time, it's the brand who's talking about this concept. The consumers, they're acknowledging it. It is something that they're talking about here and there, but it's not necessarily top of mind for consumers. We can also see that within nutritional and functional benefits, this is a very similar space where we've got a very similar shape. It's primarily being led by the brand. In the case of diet and lifestyle friendly, this is one instance where the brands are actually showing up in the same way that consumers are. Keto, plant-based, gluten-free, these are some of the different diet and lifestyle friendly attributes that both manufacturers are using to describe their products, as well as something that consumers are calling out in reviews as something that they like about these products. And lastly, we have responsible sourcing and ethics. And this is the really unique one out of all the ones we've looked into. We can see that brands are talking about this concept about 20% of the time, but it's consumers who are really leading the conversation. 75% of the time, it's coming from the consumer. And so here we've got over a 50-point gap between the two sources here. This is an area where consumers are much louder than brands. They want to know where ingredients came from, how were the animals treated, how does the farming process impact the planet? And this is one of those areas where, in this hypothetical situation, brands were being very quiet on this topic. Ultimately, the structure of this analysis really allows you to identify where are the areas that consumers are talking about that brands aren't. It enables you to make sure your innovation and your marketing is moving in a direction that is aligned with the consumer and in areas that they really care about and areas that they're talking about very frequently. Using this information, you can make sure that you're on top of your next growth trend within your category and making sure that you're really harnessing what are some of those emerging or growing demand themes that are showing up. So I just did a lot of talking. Obviously, Heather, we partnered together a lot on this project, but do you want to talk a bit about how this information was used?
Yeah, that was a great summary, John. Thanks. So what changed as a result of this work, and how has all of this helped us at Nestle? Well, you can see here, it really did confirm our hypothesis and what we were kind of seeing in terms of trends, that health and clean label is really shifting again from this subtractive, calorie restrictive diet mentality to more additive health signals and more about what food can do for you. The second thing is, by digging into these demand themes, it really showed us at Nestle where we need to dig a little bit more with our consumers through additional primary research and kind of really hone in on very specific needs that aren't being met and what we can do in terms of assortment and merchandising, as well as product innovation. And third, it also identified that gap that you just saw on the previous slide of what we as manufacturers and brands are talking about and communicating to consumers versus what they're talking about. And, kind of, is there an opportunity to close that gap? Is there an opportunity for us to focus more on these things that the consumers are focused on? And then finally, we've established a great partnership with Harmonia, where we can continue monitoring these demand spaces for clean label and just kind of see how they evolve over time and make sure that we are continuing to capitalize on the things that consumers are most interested in. John, you want to take us home?
Absolutely. So in terms of recapping some of the different methodologies that happened in this analysis, we started out by using consumer language through our review data to be able to identify what are some of the different white spaces here as it relates to clean label. From there, we identified what products are associated with each of these and ultimately plotted these different demand themes within our maturity curve to be able to identify which of these demand themes have already reached their peak in the category and are table stakes versus which ones are up and coming and future demand spaces that are currently growing and likely continue to grow. From there, we separated among these different demand themes, which ones are really primarily being communicated by the brand and isn't actually resonating with consumers in the way they're talking within reviews. But also which ones are consumers leading the conversation. And it's by identifying those areas where it's the consumers who are the ones talking about it. That's what reveals the benefit space for you and your brand or manufacturer to be able to innovate against. And so overall, this is an analysis that we do very frequently. It's something that can be highly catered, highly customized, depending on whether or not you want to analyze. Apologies for my cat. She loves the attention. Here at Harmonia, we analyze both categories as well as cats. But ultimately, this analysis can be highly catered to whatever category you might be working in. If there are different visualizations that you might be looking for or different demand themes that you want to understand, we can both identify them with the way consumers talk about it in reviews, or if you have your own demand themes that you want to analyze, that's another way that we can approach the analysis. So overall, it was a great partnership with Heather and team, and looking forward to seeing some other ways we can apply the same data.
Thank you, John and Heather. I think no matter your category, I think there's a lot of applicability on this, and some really interesting stuff, particularly around functional beverages and that labeling, which we're hearing a lot of buzz about. And what you showed a few slides back indicates that there's a lot more ground that can be covered here. So fascinating stuff. Given the health and wellness boom, and again, given the huge kind of the shifting tides in health and wellness. A couple questions before we wrap today. One that's come in, and it's around this. Can you talk a little bit, and maybe Heather and John, if you can layer in on this too, talk a little bit about the actions that you've taken to bring this alive with retailers and shoppers in category reviews or category discussions?
Yeah, I can take that. Definitely something that our retail partners are looking for from us is, constantly looking for thought leadership. And this is a great way to say, because they've got a lot of questions on it too. They see their sets kind of transforming. They're seeing, brands that are capitalizing on certain health and wellness trends doing better than others. So they have a lot of questions. So yeah, so us being able to bring in this research that you've seen, and kind of laying out like here are the opportunity areas and just helping them with merchandising, showing them where they need more of certain clean label spaces versus less of others, and just following those trends. And certainly, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's kind of led us to dig a little bit deeper with some primary consumer research and kind of fine tune that even more to bring to our retail partners.
Awesome stuff. Thank you.
I think to add on that, one of the really powerful ways that you can frame this data is show how developed some of these different demand themes are in the total US or a total channel and compare that against an individual retailer. So, for example, if we saw that sourcing and ethics was a demand theme that was growing in the total market and was 20% of the sales of the category, but at your specific retailer, it was only 5%. That might be an opportunity space where if you're able to dedicate more shelf space to that, of course, assuming it was aligned with your specific consumer, because consumers at different retailers are different. That's one way that you can utilize the data to really grow your retailer.
Great stuff, John. And kind of a follow on to that, in that this is a really compelling discussion of frozen meals. A lot of folks on this call and a wide swath of our audience, are in the adjacent categories, your snacks, your beverages, kind of related things. Give us a sense how this methodology in the four territories we talked about would hold up in something adjacent, whether it be snacks, beverages. What would be the same and what would be different in terms of how you'd approach this?
Yeah. First off, I would say this methodology can be applied to whatever category you might be looking for. So within beverages or other categories, this is certainly something we can either run these same demand themes on or create totally new ones. I would say being able to compare them across categories is actually one of the most powerful ways that you can use the data because, for example, I'll just use an adjacent category, frozen pizza. If we were to map these same demand themes within frozen pizza, those maturity stages might be totally different, where sourcing and ethics is something that is growing within frozen meals, but is already mature within frozen pizza, or as it relates to some of the other ones, like ingredient integrity or diet and lifestyle friendly. I would imagine that that specific demand thing would be different in pizza versus some of these other categories. So each category will have unique results, but you're able to, by monitoring them, you can make sure that you're staying on top of whichever demand theme is growing within your specific category today.
One last question before we wrap today. Um, we you talk to folks in retail and CPG, everything moves faster in terms of reviews, change, decisions that might have taken a year, the time, the life cycle that's moved to 6 months, and the 6 month ones are 3 months, and things just go quicker. So with regards to this analysis, um, if you're looking at clean label, is it a stable enough category to revisit annually, or do you need an even tighter cycle now, considering the boom of health and wellness? What would be your thought on that, John?
It is something that I would refresh more than annually. I think, everyone is aware of how quickly some of these trends can pop up. I think of specific ingredients like red 40 or seed oils or like beef tallow is an example where out of nowhere it just
Yeah.
totally boomed and became this new buzzword that's all over the place. And so really it's like making sure you're keeping up with the consumer and following the way that they're reacting to some of these different trends because they do change very quickly.
And I would just add on to that. It is health and wellness with, particularly within food is such a hot topic. That yeah, being able to access these reviews and having like a pulse on what consumers are talking about right now, and how it evolves and how it shifts is really important to us because, like I said, it's huge. It's a huge topic in our business right now.
A great way to end. Heather, I'm glad you weighed in on that too, and just in terms of what you're noticing as well. John, I know you're a Chicago local. I was picking up food at Smoke, the barbecue place, on Sunday, and even they had beef tallow for sale. Yeah, you're right. It's popping up everywhere. It's beef tallow is going to soon become table stakes for everywhere in terms of, yeah,
True.
we have beef tallow, but we're a car wash regardless. Great stuff, John Groth, Heather Bentley. This was awesome. I think an eye opener on a lot of things. And again, we'll have this up in our campus library. We're also going to work to clip this and get it onto social and get it, get some more sort of lift on this in terms of sharing it out. I think there's a lot of folks here that again are competing in health and wellness and need to kind of see some of the trends that were unearthed here today. So thank you each both for your time and contributions today. And again, keep it here with the CMA. We've got a busy programming schedule coming up here as we get into summer. So again, Heather, John, all the best to you. Have a great weekend, and we'll be back here soon for another webinar next week. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.